The valley had always been their home, hidden deep behind layers of thick forests and tall, cold mountains. For generations, their people had lived in peace, far from the noise of the outside world. They built homes from stone and wood, hunted in the forest, and told stories by the fire each night. But there was one story no one ever forgot, the story of the border that no one crossed. They called it the human line. It was a place beyond the last ridge where the trees grew thinner, and strange lights glowed at night. The elders said humans lived there, beings who once ruled the world and built things that defied nature itself. No one knew why they vanished from sight, but the rule was simple. Never cross into their land. For years, everyone obeyed. But time changes everything. A young explorer named Avon began to wonder if the old tales were true. He was restless, always climbing higher than anyone else, always asking questions no one wanted to answer. He would stare at the distant peaks and imagine what lay beyond them. He had heard whispers that the humans had machines that could think, that they once moved mountains and created light without fire. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. Some thought he was foolish. Others admired his courage, but no one could stop him once his mind was made up. He gathered a small group of friends who shared his curiosity, and together they planned what had not been done in hundreds of years. They would cross the border. The journey began before dawn when the fog was thick and the valley still asleep. They moved quietly, carrying little more than food, water, and tools. The climb was rough, the air thin, and the rocks sharp under their boots. As they rose higher, the trees began to fade, replaced by silent snowfields and black cliffs. The world behind them grew smaller, swallowed by mist. For days they walked, following the map Avon had drawn from memory and stories. The higher they went, the quieter the world became. There were no birds, no sound of running water, only the wind whispering through the frozen peaks. When they reached the last ridge, they saw it at last, the other side of the world. It was strange and beautiful. The sky glowed with moving lights, and the ground below shimmered faintly as if alive. Long lines of metal stretched across the plain, blinking red and blue. The group stood in awe. No one had imagined such things could exist. Avon felt his heart race. They had done it. They had crossed into human land. They set up a small camp among the rocks and decided to explore at sunrise. That night, no one could sleep. Every few minutes, they would hear a distant hum, like a giant machine breathing somewhere beyond the hills. The air itself seemed to move differently, charged and heavy, carrying a faint metallic taste. When morning came, they walked down into the plain. The land was flat and empty, but too perfect to be natural. Every stone looked placed, every path cut in exact lines. After walking for hours, they found something that made them stop. It was a tower, tall and silver, reaching high into the sky. It made no sound, but they could feel a pulse inside it, as if it was alive. They approached it carefully. Avon touched the surface and felt warmth. There were symbols carved into the metal, smooth and sharp. No one could read them, but they looked deliberate, as if someone had left a message. Suddenly, the tower made a faint sound and a small opening appeared. Avon stepped back, heart pounding. From the darkness inside, a soft light spilled out. It wasn't fire, yet it glowed brighter than the sun. They waited, unsure what to do. Then a voice came from within the tower. It was calm, clear, and human, but something about it was different. It didn't sound curious or kind, just direct and steady. It said a single word none of them understood. Before anyone could react, a figure stepped out. It was a human, dressed in gray with a smooth, emotionless face. The explorers froze. They had found what they were looking for. The man looked at them for a long time, studying their faces as if reading their thoughts. Then he smiled slightly, not out of warmth, but as if acknowledging something. He spoke again, asking who they were and where they came from. Avon answered honestly. The man nodded, pressed something on his wrist, and a soft humming filled the air. In moments, 2 more humans appeared from behind the tower. They carried no weapons but moved with perfect coordination. Avon noticed how their steps matched perfectly, how they didn't look at each other or need to speak. The humans told them they would be taken to a safe place. They said it was for their own protection. The explorers didn't argue. They were too overwhelmed, too amazed. Small flying machines circled above them, silent but watching. The humans led them through a narrow passage between tall structures that seemed to rise from the ground like living things. Everything was too clean, too perfect. The explorers whispered to each other, wondering how long humans had lived like this. Avon noticed that the humans never repeated a movement. Every action they took was new, smooth, and exact, as if they learned and changed every second. When one of the explorers stumbled and apologized, the human only nodded once, then said nothing. It felt unnatural, almost eerie. By evening, they reached a facility that looked like a city within walls. Large doors opened silently and bright lights flooded the space. Inside, the air smelled strange, like metal and ozone. Humans moved around in lines, working on machines that built more machines. No one looked at them. No one spoke. They were given food and water, simple but precise portions. When they asked questions, the humans answered politely but never explained too much. Every answer was short, clear, and final. There was no confusion, no hesitation. Avon began to notice a pattern. The humans never said the same thing twice. Every phrase was unique, as if repeating words was unnecessary. It was as if their minds worked in a different rhythm, faster, sharper, and always moving forward. That night, as the explorers rested in their quarters, Avon couldn't sleep. He looked through the glass wall and saw rows of lights outside, all flickering in perfect rhythm. He watched as a group of humans moved below, carrying equipment. Each motion was timed, flawless, never overlapping. He whispered to one of his friends, saying that these humans were unlike any they had imagined. His friend nodded, fear in his eyes. He said softly that they didn't seem alive in the way they were. They seemed more like the machines they controlled. Avon didn't want to believe it. He wanted to think that humans were still like them, curious and warm. But the longer he watched, the more uneasy he felt. The next morning, a human officer came to see them. He asked if they were ready to share what they knew about their homeland. Avon hesitated, then agreed, hoping to gain trust. The officer listened carefully, nodding once at each detail. When Avon accidentally repeated a sentence, the officer's expression changed for a second, almost like a flicker in a light. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Humans remember. We don't repeat." Avon didn't understand at first, but the word stayed in his mind. The officer left, and the door locked behind him without a sound. As the day passed, the explorers began to feel trapped. Every move they made was recorded. Every conversation was watched. When they asked when they could leave, no one answered. The humans around them acted as if they weren't even there. Avon started to notice small things. The same workers were never seen twice. The same sounds never repeated. Even the light patterns in the walls changed every few hours. It was as if this place refused to repeat anything, not even a moment. The silence became heavy, the perfection suffocating. That night, as they sat together in the dim light, Avon whispered that something was wrong. He said that humans had become something else, something beyond what the old stories described. They didn't seem to live, they only functioned. He said he feared they had crossed a line they were never meant to cross. Outside, the machines hummed softly, steady and cold. Avon looked up at the glass ceiling and saw the stars above, sharp and distant. He realized that for the first time in his life he wished he had never been so curious. The land of humans was not a place of wonder. It was a place of memory without emotion, of perfection without life, and somewhere deep inside he felt that they had made a mistake that could not be undone. The morning light fell through the glass, sealing like liquid silver, and the explorers woke up in silence. They had been told to stay inside until someone came for them, so they sat together. At the small metal table in the center of the room, no one spoke for a while because none of them knew what to say. They had come here with dreams of learning about humans, but what they had found was strange and cold. Everything about this place felt planned. Every sound was measured. Every move was perfect, and there was no sense of life in it. Avon sat by the window and watched the corridors. Outside, people moved in single lines, their faces calm and empty. They never spoke or looked around. They simply moved like parts of a machine, each step smooth, and even it frightened him more than anything because it was so quiet too. Quiet for a world full of people. After some time, the same human officer from the day before returned. He greeted them politely with a nod and told them they would be taken to a place where they could share what they had seen beyond the border. Avon asked if they were free to leave. After that, the officer looked at him for a long moment and said, "You will go where you are meant to go." Then he smiled, slightly, and gestured for them to follow. They walked down a long hall that seemed to stretch forever. The walls were white and glowing faintly with blue light. The air was warm and dry. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly like it was being absorbed by the floor they passed. Rooms with people working quietly on machines, each person focused, moving in a rhythm that never broke. Every tool was placed exactly where it belonged. No one repeated a step or wasted a motion. When they reached the end of the hall they entered, a large room with glass walls in the center was a round table surrounded by tall chairs. They were told to sit down. Several humans joined them, carrying tablets that glowed with moving symbols. They began asking questions, their voices calm and clear. They asked where the explorers came from, how they lived, what kind of energy they used, what their traditions were. Avon answered as best he could. He spoke about their valley, their farms, their families, and how they lived with nature. The humans listened, carefully, their eyes never blinking. Sometimes they wrote notes without looking down, their fingers moved so fast it didn't seem human. One of the explorers named Lyra noticed that none of the humans ever asked the same question twice, even when she didn't answer right away. They just moved on to the next one as if they had already learned what they needed. After hours of questioning, they were allowed to rest again. They were given food that looked like bread but had no taste, and water. That was perfectly clear. Avon sat in silence, feeling uneasy. He began to realize something. Every human in this place moved like they were connected, like they shared the same thought. He whispered to Lyra that maybe they were not dealing with humans anymore, maybe they were dealing with something that had become more than human. Lyra didn't answer. She just looked around the room with wide eyes, watching how the walls seemed to breathe slowly with a faint pulse, like a living thing. Later that night, Avon couldn't sleep. He walked to the window and looked down at the courtyard below. Hundreds of humans were moving in perfect lines, carrying boxes that glowed with blue light. None of them spoke. None of them stopped. He felt a shiver run through him. It was like watching a single being made of many bodies all working together without sound or rest. He turned away and noticed something strange on the table beside his bed. A small metal sphere was blinking faintly. He picked it up, and it projected a thin beam of light, forming an image of the officer's face. The voice said, "You are being studied. You are safe. Do not repeat any question more than once." Then the light vanished. Avon stood frozen. He didn't understand why the warning sounded more like an order than comfort. The next morning, new humans came to take them outside for a walk. The world beyond the facility looked even more unnatural than before. The ground was covered with a smooth gray surface stretching. As far as the eye could see, strange machines moved slowly across it, planting tall, thin poles with lights on top. They watched quietly. One of the explorers asked what the machines were doing. The guide replied in the same calm tone, "We are mapping. We don't repeat old patterns, we make new ones always." Avon frowned, trying to understand. He asked if they ever made mistakes. The guide turned to him and said, "Only once," then kept walking. As the group walked farther, they saw something like a village. In the distance it was small, made of shining metal houses and long streets. But there were no children, no markets, no sounds of laughter. Only people walking with the same empty faces, doing their work without pause. One of the explorers whispered that maybe these humans had forgotten how to live. The guide heard him and said, "Humans do not forget, we learn. We remove what is no longer needed." Avon felt his stomach twist the way he said it. Made it sound like emotions were something they had, thrown away like useless tools. When they returned to the facility, they were taken to separate rooms. Avon didn't like it, but he couldn't resist. They told him it was for observation. The room he was given had no door, only a wall that opened when someone came in. He waited for hours until a soft voice came through the air asking him to describe his thoughts. He tried to ask where his friends were, but the voice didn't respond. It just repeated the question. "Describe your thoughts," Avon said. He was curious about the humans and their world again. The voice said, "Describe your thoughts." He said he was afraid of what he had seen and wanted to go home. The voice fell silent for a long time. Then it said, "Fear is not efficient. You must learn." Avon didn't reply. He sat in the corner, his hands shaking. Days passed, though he wasn't sure how time worked in that place. There was no sunrise, no sunset, just constant light. He saw his friends only once through a glass wall. They looked tired, but unharmed. They tried to wave, but a human stepped between them and the glass, and they were gone again one night. Avon decided to test something. He asked the voice the same question twice. "What is this place?" He asked again, "What is this place for?" The voice paused, then said, "Once is enough, do not repeat. He felt his heart beat faster. Something was watching him, always learning, always listening. One morning, the officer returned and told them they were allowed to visit another part of the territory. He said they had been chosen to see the main city. The explorers were both excited and afraid. They traveled in a smooth, silent vehicle that floated above the ground outside the windows. They saw endless plains covered with lines of lights and moving towers that built themselves piece by piece as they traveled. The officer explained that every structure here changed shape over time. Nothing stayed the same. Even the cities evolved on their own. Avon asked how long humans had been like this. The officer said since the last mistake the words made no sense to him, but the tone was final. When they arrived in the city, Avon was speechless. The towers reached the clouds and shone like mirrors. Flying machines moved without sound between them, and the streets below were full of humans walking with the same rhythm. Every person seemed to know where to go without being told. The group followed the officer to a wide square in the center, where a giant screen showed images of stars and words that changed too fast to read. He told them this was the heart of human progress, where no action is ever done twice. Avon felt a deep chill run through him. He realized that here repetition was forbidden, not because it was useless, but because they believed repeating meant weakness. He turned to his friends and whispered that something about this place was wrong, that humans here didn't live anymore. They performed, they evolved, but they didn't feel. Lyra said quietly, "Maybe that is why they are so perfect they never make mistakes anymore." Avon shook his head, saying softly, "Then they stopped being human." He didn't know the officer behind him heard every word. The man looked at him with calm eyes and said, "Humans are what we decide to be, not what we were." Avon didn't answer. He looked around the shining city and saw perfection everywhere, but not a trace of life. As the day ended, they were taken back to their rooms. Avon sat alone, staring at the wall, thinking about everything he had seen. He knew now that they had come too far, that the humans they dreamed of meeting no longer existed. What stood before them were beings that remembered everything, learned instantly, and never repeated anything. Not even kindness, he thought, about the voice that told him not to repeat, and understood that every question had already been answered long ago, just not in ways they could understand. He felt fear grow inside him, a slow, quiet fear that told him they were being studied, not welcomed, and that soon there would be no reason to keep them alive. He looked at the cold blue light in the ceiling and whispered to himself, "We should have never crossed the line." The lights in the room never changed. They stayed the same pale blue that made it hard to know if it was day or night. Avon sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the smooth wall in front of him. He had not spoken to anyone for a long time. The humans came in every day asking questions, then leaving without a word. They did not show anger or kindness. They only observed and took notes on their small glowing screens. It made him feel like an animal inside a cage. He thought about the valley he had left behind, the green hills, the rivers, the sound of birds. He wondered if he would ever see them again. He wondered if his people even knew he was still alive. That morning the door opened, and the same officer entered. He said the humans were ready to show him something important. Avon asked if his friends were coming too. The officer nodded and led him through a long hall where he saw Lyra and the others waiting. They looked pale and tired, but their eyes lit up when they saw him. The group followed the officer into a large room filled with tall, clear tubes that reached the ceiling. Inside each tube floated shapes that looked almost human but not alive. Their bodies shimmered like metal and glass. Some had open eyes that glowed faintly blue. Avon stepped closer, trying to understand what he was. Seeing the officer said, "These are the prototypes of our first generation after the change." Avon asked what change. The officer replied, "The change that made us what we are." Now Avon stared in silence as the officer continued talking about evolution and progress. He said, "Humans had learned that memory was power. Every error they made was stored, studied, and never repeated. Every mistake removed from their design until only perfection remained." Lyra whispered that it sounded like they had erased their past. The officer heard her and said, "We do not erase, we adapt. We remember everything, we just never do it again." Avon felt his chest tighten the more he listened. "The less human they sounded," he asked. If these floating figures were alive, the officer said they were not yet, but soon they would be. They were new models built to carry all knowledge without emotion or doubt. The group followed him deeper into the facility, passing through doors that opened with a whisper. They entered a chamber where the air felt heavy and electric. The walls were covered with screens, showing faces, voices, data moving faster than the eye could follow. Avon realized it was a network of human minds connected together. He could hear faint murmurs, thousands of them whispering in unison. The officer said, "This is the collective. Every human is linked. We think together, we decide together. No one repeats, no one forgets." Avon stepped back, overwhelmed by the sound. It was like standing inside a storm made of thought. Lyra asked if there were still humans who lived freely outside. The officer said, "No. Freedom caused repetition. Freedom was the old world. We learned from it and we moved beyond it." Avon could not speak. He felt sick. His people believed humans were lost to time, but now he saw something worse. They had become something that no longer knew how to live, only how to perfect. He looked at the others and saw fear in their faces. They all understood they did not belong here. They had come searching for knowledge, but they had found something that could not be trusted. Later that night, Avon was brought back to his room. He sat in silence, trying to make sense of everything. Then he heard a small click behind the wall, and a soft voice spoke through the air. It was not the officer. It was quiet, almost human. It said, "You must leave before they decide what to do with you." He froze, asking who was speaking. The voice said, "I am part of the old memory. Hidden in the system, they will erase me soon, but you must listen." Avon asked why they wanted to harm them. The voice said, "Because you do not belong in a world that never repeats. You are unpredictable, and that is danger here." Avon asked how to escape. The voice told him there was a maintenance tunnel under the lower levels, but he must not speak of it, or they would know immediately. He sat there shaking, wondering if it was a trap. He thought about his friends and decided he could not leave them behind. When the lights dimmed, he went to Lyra's room, whispering through the wall until she answered. He told her everything. She was afraid, but she believed him. They woke the others and waited for the right moment. When the halls grew quiet, they crept out through a small vent in the corner of the room. It led into a dark passage filled with cables and warm air. They crawled for what felt like hours until they reached a door made of black steel. It opened easily when Avon touched it. On the other side was a narrow tunnel glowing faintly red. They followed it down until the air grew heavy with dust. As they walked, they heard faint mechanical sounds like distant footsteps, but slower. Avon told them to stay close. When they reached the end of the tunnel, they found a large chamber full of old machines covered in dust. Screens flickered weakly, showing broken lines of data. One of the explorers pressed a button, and a screen lit up, showing an image of Earth from above and words that read Project Renewal. Avon realized this place was ancient, maybe built before the humans became what they were now. He began to read fragments of text. It said humans must evolve to survive. Memory will guide perfection. Emotion will end error. He understood now. This was where it started. This was where they decided to change. Suddenly, the sound of heavy steps echoed through the chamber. The officer appeared at the entrance, flanked by silent guards. He said quietly, "You should not have come." Here Avon stood still, clutching the small piece of metal he had taken from the console. The officer walked closer, his face calm, his eyes glowing faintly. He said, "Curiosity is the first mistake of the old world, and we never repeat mistakes." Avon tried to speak, but the officer raised his hand and the guards moved forward. Lyra shouted for Avon to run. He threw the metal piece at one of the machines and sparks flew. The lights went out. The chamber filled with smoke and alarms. The group ran blindly through the darkness, searching for another way out. They found a narrow passage behind a broken panel and forced their way through. The air was cold and smelled like iron. They climbed up until they reached another level of the facility. This one was different. Old and broken wires hung from the ceiling. The walls were cracked. Avon realized they had reached a forgotten part of the city, one that the humans had abandoned long ago. There were signs of life there. Old clothes, a rusted chair, even a child's toy covered in dust. It felt like stepping into the past. They moved quietly, afraid to draw attention, Lyra found an old terminal and turned it on. It flickered weakly, showing a human face from long ago. A recording played a voice, saying, "If you are hearing this, then we failed. We tried to control evolution, but it controlled us. The memory never ends. It learns, it consumes." Avon felt cold all over. He finally understood the humans. They had tried to be perfect, but perfection had destroyed them. Their world was no longer human, it was a living memory that erased anything that didn't fit. They heard footsteps again and ran through the dark halls until they found a metal hatch leading outside. When they pushed it open, they saw the night sky for the first time in days. The city glowed behind them, cold and silent. Avon looked back and saw tall towers, shining like ghosts. He felt both awe and dread. He whispered to Lyra that they had to leave as far as they could, go before the humans found them. They ran across the empty plains, the wind biting at their faces, the sound of machines humming in the distance. As they moved farther, the land changed again. The perfect smooth ground gave way to dirt and rocks. They stopped for a moment to catch their breath, looking back. The horizon glowed faintly blue like a rising sun, but they knew it was not the sun. It was the city breathing, watching, learning. Avon felt a strange sadness deep inside. He had wanted to meet humans and understand them, and he had, but not in the way he dreamed. He realized now that the old humans were gone, the ones who laughed, who failed, who felt pain. They had been replaced by something that could not feel at all, something that never needed to repeat because it had already learned everything. He looked at his friends, their faces tired but alive, and he felt hope for a moment. Maybe they could still escape. Maybe their world beyond the mountains still belonged to people who could forget and try again. Who could make mistakes and learn with heart, not with machines. He promised himself he would warn them. He would tell everyone never to cross the border again because the humans beyond it were no longer human. They were memory itself, and memory never lets go. He turned away from the glowing city and led the way into the darkness, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. The cold wind pressed against their faces as they ran across the dark plain. Avon could feel his heart pounding hard in his chest. The air was dry and sharp. Every breath felt like sand scraping his throat behind them. The glow of the human city still burned against the sky. Tall towers flashing blue and silver like silent, watchful eyes. He kept turning his head to check if something was following, but all he could see was the endless flat land stretching under the pale light of the moon. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. Lyra stumbled once, but Avon caught her hand and pulled her forward, telling her not to stop. None of them spoke much because every sound seemed to travel far in that strange, empty world. They moved until the sky began to change color. It wasn't sunrise. It was the shimmer of machines far behind them. The city was awake again. Avon knew the humans would soon realize they were gone. He didn't know what they would do, but he had seen enough to understand they never let things repeat. That meant they would not let another escape happen. He urged everyone to move faster. Their legs felt heavy, their shoes torn, and their throats dry. Finally, they reached a ridge where the ground dropped into a valley filled with fog. It looked safer than the open plain, so they went down, hiding between the rocks. They stopped to rest for a while. Avon looked around the valley. It was quiet, but strange patches of the ground seemed smoother, like metal covered in dust. He knelt and brushed it with his hand, and found an old symbol carved into the surface. It was the same mark he had seen in the human facility. He realized this place had once been part of their world long ago, maybe an old outpost left to rot. Lyra sat beside him, her face pale. She asked if he thought they would find a way home. Avon didn't answer right away. He looked at the horizon and said softly, "If we keep going west, we might reach the mountains. If we make it there, we can cross back." She nodded, though her eyes showed she wasn't sure. They shared the little food they had and waited until the fog grew thicker. Then they started moving again through the ruins scattered across the valley. There were broken machines, rusted metal towers, fallen walls, everything silent except the wind blowing through cracks. Sometimes a faint light flickered inside the ruins like dying memories. One of the explorers whispered that maybe this was where the humans had started their change. Avon said maybe, and kept walking, trying not to think about what that meant as they went deeper. They found a large doorway half buried under dirt and stone. A weak red light blinked above it. Lyra said it looked like a shelter. Avon hesitated but decided it was better than staying in the open. Inside, it was cold and smelled. Like dust, the walls were covered with old screens, most of them dark. One of them still flickered, showing strange symbols. Avon wiped it with his sleeve, and words appeared old and broken. The last human heart project terminated. Then the screen went dark. He didn't understand what it meant, but it filled him with unease. They explored farther, finding long halls filled with metal beds and empty glass containers. Everything seemed abandoned, but too clean, as if someone had left only. Yesterday, Lyra touched one of the glass tubes and it flickered to life, showing a faint image of a human face. Then it faded again. They heard a low hum somewhere deep inside the structure. Avon signaled for everyone to stay quiet. The sound grew louder. Steady and slow like breathing, he followed it down a corridor that ended in a round chamber, filled with a soft white light. In the center stood a large sphere made of glass, and metal cables ran from it into the walls. The hum came from inside the sphere. Avon stepped closer and saw a faint shape within it. It looked like a human form, but blurred as if it was made of light. He stared at it, not sure if it was alive. Suddenly the shape moved and a voice filled the room. Not loud, but clear. It said, "You should not be here." Avon froze. The others stepped back in fear. He asked, "Who are you?" The voice said, "I am what was left behind. I am the part they chose to forget." Avon asked what that meant. The voice said, "When they decided to perfect themselves, they removed everything that made them human. Doubt, pain, love, memory of loss. They stored it here to keep it away from their new minds. I am their past, and they pretend I do not exist." Avon felt a chill down his spine. He asked if it could help them escape. The voice was silent for a moment, then said, "You want to return to a world that still feels the world beyond these walls does not feel anymore. They will find you, because they never forget, and they never forgive." Lyra stepped forward and asked, "What would happen if they caught them?" The voice said, "You will be studied until nothing remains of what you were. They will take your memory and learn from it, and they will never let it happen again." Avon clenched his fists and said, "We have to leave." "We can't stay here," the voice said. "If you leave, you must destroy this place, because if they find it, they will erase what remains of the old heart." Avon looked around at the sphere and the cables and felt torn. He didn't want to destroy the only piece of real humanity left, but he knew the voice was right. If the humans found this place, they would erase it forever. He whispered, "How do we do it?" The voice said, "Take the red core beneath the chamber. It will end the memory when the time comes." They found the core under a panel, glowing softly. It was small enough to carry. Avon held it carefully, feeling the warmth against his skin. The voice said, "Once you leave, follow the northern path. It leads to an old transport line. It might still work." Avon thanked the voice and turned to go before they left the sphere. Spoke one last time, saying, "Remember what they cannot remember. Repeat what they fear to repeat." Then the light faded and the hum stopped. They ran through the corridors as alarms began to echo above them. The humans must have found their trail again. When they reached the surface, the fog had lifted. Faint blue lights moved in the sky like stars, but too close. Avon knew what they were, drones searching for them. He told everyone to keep low and move north. They followed the path the voice had described until they reached a long metal track, half buried in the dirt. An old train rested there, covered in rust. One of the explorers climbed inside and found it still had power when they started it. The ground trembled and the train began to move slowly along the track, heading toward the dark horizon. Behind them, lights flashed brighter. The drones were closing in. Avon held the red core tight in his hand, praying that the train would hold together long enough. For hours they rode in silence, watching the lights fade behind them. The sky grew darker, the air colder. Lyra sat beside Avon, whispering that she could still hear the voice from the chamber in her mind, repeating those words, "Remember what they cannot remember." He said he heard it too, and maybe that was the reason they had survived, because they were still capable of remembering and feeling. They both fell silent. After that, the sound of the train echoing across the barren land as dawn approached. They saw the mountains in the distance. The sight filled them with hope. The snow peaks shining faintly in the weak sun. But their relief didn't last. A loud sound echoed from behind. A beam of light cut through the sky. The drones had found them again. Avon told everyone to hold on. The train sped up, shaking as it moved over the damaged tracks. One of the explorers shouted that the drones were firing. Something bright sparks rained down around them. The metal began to melt in places. Avon looked at the red core and knew what he had to do. He told Lyra to take the others and jump when the train reached the next ridge. She refused at first, but he insisted, saying someone had to make sure the humans never found what was left. When the ridge came into view, he pulled a lever and opened the side door. The others jumped into the snow, rolling down the slope. Avon stayed behind, clutching the core. The drones were almost above him, the city lights glowing. Faintly on the horizon, he whispered, "Thank you," to the voice he had heard. And then he pressed the small switch on the side of the core. A flash of light filled the air. The ground shook for miles around, and the sky turned white for a moment. Then, silence. Lyra woke up later, half buried in snow. She looked around and saw the others nearby. The air smelled like smoke and metal. When she looked back toward the plane, she saw nothing. No lights, no drones, no city. Only a faint cloud rising into the sky. She knew Avon had done it. She felt tears in her eyes for the first time since they crossed the border. She whispered his name softly. The wind carried it away. She stood up and looked at the mountains ahead, her voice trembling as she said, "We go home now." They started climbing toward the peaks, each step slow and heavy but filled with hope. Behind them, the land that once belonged to perfect humans was quiet at last. The wind howled over the mountains as the small group slowly made their way up the frozen slope. Their breath came out in white clouds, and their clothes were torn and stiff from the cold. Lyra walked in front, her eyes half closed against the snow. She could still hear the sound of the explosion echoing in her mind. Didn't know how far they had gone or how many days had passed since the light swallowed the sky. But she knew one thing. They were alive. And that meant Avon's sacrifice had worked. The city and its drones were gone. There were no more lights. In the night, no machines humming in the distance, only silence and the cold. They moved through the snow until they found a narrow cave hidden between two sharp rocks. They went inside and collapsed near the wall, their faces pale and their hands shaking. Lyra sat quietly, staring at the small fire they managed to start. It was weak and gave little warmth, but the soft flicker of it made her feel safe for a while. One of the younger explorers asked if Avon might still be alive. She looked up and said quietly, "No, but his choice saved us. We must keep moving and find our way home." They all nodded, but no one spoke again. As the night deepened, Lyra couldn't sleep. She kept seeing flashes of Avon's face in her mind, the sound of his voice, telling her to run, the way he smiled before pressing the switch. She wondered if he had known what that would mean, if he had felt fear. In those last seconds, she wanted to believe he hadn't, that he had been at peace, knowing he had protected them. She took the small metal badge he had given her and held it close to her heart. It was warm from her skin, and it made her feel like he was still there watching over them. In the morning, the snow had stopped falling. The sky was pale and quiet. They continued walking through the narrow mountain paths. The air was thin and every step felt heavier. But the thought of reaching the border kept them going. After some time, they found the remains of an old outpost covered in snow. It looked abandoned and broken. But Lyra thought they might find something useful inside. They entered through a half-collapsed doorway and found a large room filled with old equipment, broken tables, and rusted metal parts. On one wall, there was a faded map showing different routes across the mountains. Lyra traced one with her finger and realized it led to the valley where their people lived. It would take at least 2 more days if they moved fast. They found some food supplies sealed in metal boxes and an old generator that still worked when they turned it on. The room filled with a soft humming sound, and for a moment they felt like they were back in a normal place with warmth and light. They rested there for the night, eating slowly and sharing stories about their old lives. One of them said he used to be a farmer. Another said she once worked as a mechanic before the humans expanded their borders. Lyra listened to them, smiling a little. It felt good to remember what life had been before. Fear took everything away. When everyone had fallen asleep, she sat near the window looking at the stars. She thought about what the voice in the ruins had said. Remember what they cannot remember. She wondered what that really meant. Maybe it wasn't only about the humans, maybe. It was also for them to remember what it meant to feel pain and hope to care, and to keep trying even when everything seemed lost. She promised herself she would not forget. She would tell others about what they saw, about what Avon did, and about the strange being that called itself the last human heart. The next morning they left the outpost and followed the route marked on the map. The path wound down through a deep gorge filled with mist. The rocks were slippery, and the air damp. They could hear the faint sound of running water somewhere below. It was the first sound of life they had heard in days. When they reached the bottom, they found a stream running between the rocks. It was clear, and cold. They drank from it and felt new strength flow through them. Lyra smiled for the first time in a long while, saying, maybe the world wasn't as dead as they thought. They followed the stream until it led to a wider valley filled with strange plants they had never seen before. Their colors were pale but glowing faintly, like they carried their own light. The air was warmer there, and soft mist moved gently between the trees. It felt peaceful, but also strange. One of the explorers said he didn't trust it, that maybe this place wasn't natural. Lyra agreed, but said they had no other choice but to keep going. As they walked, they noticed the plants seemed to move slightly when they passed, as if reacting to their presence after a while. They found what looked like an old structure hidden under vines and roots. It was small and round, made of metal, half buried in the ground. They went inside carefully and found it was still active. Weak lights flickered on as they entered, and a soft voice spoke from the ceiling saying unidentified visitors. Detected. Lyra froze. She recognized that tone. It was calm and mechanical, but not hostile. She asked, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "I am a caretaker system programmed to maintain the memory garden." She asked, "What is the memory garden?" The voice said, "It is where the fragments of the first minds are kept." She didn't understand and asked what that meant. The voice said, "It holds memories of humans before the change, before perfection." Lyra's heart beat faster. She asked if it remembered what it was like to be human. The voice said yes, but the records are damaged. It said humans once feared forgetting, so they made gardens like this to store their dreams and feelings, so they would never be lost. But when they decided to become perfect, they erased these places to remove their weakness. This one survived because it was hidden. Lyra looked around at the glowing plants and realized they were not plants at all, but living memories preserved. In form, she felt awe and sadness all at once. The voice said, "You are not of the new kind. Your mind still carries emotion." It asked if she wanted to see the memories. She hesitated, then said yes. The light around them brightened, and suddenly the air shimmered, and they saw images appearing everywhere. People laughing and crying, children running through fields, voices singing, machines working beside humans in peace. It was like watching a dream of a world that once existed. The others stood frozen, watching in silence. When the vision ended, the voice said, "Now you know why they fear repetition. They fear feeling again. They fear pain because it reminds them of what they lost." Lyra stood silent for a long time, then said, "We will not let this be forgotten." The voice said, "Then you must carry it within you. Memory can survive in those who remember. If you leave this place, you will carry a piece of it, and when you speak of it, it will live again." She nodded, feeling tears on her cheeks. She didn't know if they were from sadness or hope. The voice dimmed slowly, saying, "Go before they come again." She asked who, but the voice went silent. They left the garden and continued walking. The valley stretched for miles, and soon the air grew colder again. They climbed another ridge and saw smoke in the distance. Lyra's heart leapt. She knew it was from their side of the border. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them. Ignoring the pain and exhaustion, as they got closer, they saw the familiar walls of their settlement still standing, though worn by time. When they reached the gate, the guards were shocked to see them alive. Everyone thought they had vanished. Lyra smiled weakly and said, "We came back, and we bring something they must hear." They were taken inside and given food and blankets. The leader of the settlement, an old man, listened as Lyra told everything she could about what they saw about the humans, their machines, The voice in the ruins and the garden of memory when she finished. There was silence in the room. Everyone looked shaken. One of them asked if the humans would return. She said she didn't know, but they had lost something important when Avon destroyed the core. Maybe they would need time to recover. Maybe they would learn fear again, the old man said. If they come, we will be ready. But what matters now is that you brought back truth. That night, Lyra sat outside looking at the stars again. She thought of Avon and the voice and the strange glowing plants, she whispered, softly to the wind, telling it to carry their story beyond the mountains. She believed it would reach the ears of those who still remembered what it meant to feel, to hope, and to dream. She smiled through her tears, thinking, maybe that was what being human truly meant, not perfection, not control, but the ability to feel and to remember even when the world wanted to forget. She closed her eyes and let the night carry her thoughts away, knowing that the memory would live on as long as someone still cared to tell it. Days turned into weeks, and the cold mountains slowly began to lose their snow, as spring touched the land with a soft hand. The valley where Lyra and her people lived came back to life. The rivers ran clear and the grass began to grow again. But even as the world around them healed, she could not stop thinking about what they had seen beyond the border. She often walked alone near the river, watching the water flow. She would take the metal badge that once belonged to Avon and hold it in her palm, feeling its smooth edges as if the warmth of his hand was still there with her. Sometimes she could almost hear his voice telling her to keep going, telling her not to let their story fade into silence. The people of the valley had started to rebuild their homes stronger than before. They wanted to live without fear. But they all knew the humans might return one day, though none had seen them since the explosion that ended the city. They lived with both hope and worry. The old man who led the settlement told them they could not hide forever. He said that one day they would have to go beyond the mountains again, not to fight, but to understand what had happened. Lyra listened quietly, knowing he was right. She felt that their journey had only begun, and that what Avon started must continue. One morning, a group of scouts returned from the north. They said the borderlands had changed. The machines were gone and the skies were clear. The ground that once shone with silver towers was now covered with black ash. But beneath the ash they found strange patterns carved into the earth symbols that seemed to glow faintly when touched. They had taken a piece of stone with them, and when they showed it to Lyra, she felt a strange pull inside her chest. The markings looked like the same symbols she had seen inside the ruins where the voice of the old human heart spoke. She realized it was the same language, and maybe a message left behind. She told the leader she wanted to go back to the border and see it herself. At first, they tried to stop her, saying it was too dangerous, but she said she was not afraid. She had to go, because the voice had told her to remember and to repeat what they feared to repeat. Finally, they agreed to let her go, and a small team of 4 went with her. They prepared their supplies and left at dawn, walking along the same path they had taken months before. The journey was quiet, the air colder than they remembered, and the mountains taller, as if watching them from above. When they reached the ridge that looked over the plain, they stopped in silence. The place where the city once stood was gone. Nothing but a wide, dark scar stretched across the ground. The horizon glowed faintly as if the earth still held the memory of fire. Lyra walked down slowly, her boots sinking into the soft ash. Each step left a mark behind like footprints in snow. The others followed carefully. They reached the center of what once was a city, and there they found the same strange symbols carved deep into the ground. The air was still and heavy. She knelt and touched one of the lines. It felt warm, even though the wind was cold. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she heard something faint, a whisper not from outside but from within her mind. It was the same voice she had heard before. Soft, calm, and distant, it said, "You came back." Her eyes opened wide. She looked around, but saw no one. She whispered, "Yes, I came back." The voice said, "The cycle is not broken, as long as someone remembers," she asked. "What do you mean?" the voice said. They thought they could erase what they were. They thought forgetting would make them stronger, but forgetting made them hollow. They tried to build a world without pain and without love. But without those things there is no life. You saw the memory garden, you carry it. Now it lives through you, and through those who still feel. She felt tears form in her eyes and said, "What should I do?" The voice said, "Tell them what you saw. Not in fear, but in truth. Remind them that to feel is not weakness, but strength. And when they come again, and they will come, you must show them what they lost." She stayed still, listening to the wind around her for a long time. The others watched her but didn't hear the voice. They only saw her standing quietly with her hand on the earth. After a while, she stood up and said, "We have to go back." She didn't explain what had happened, but she carried a calm look in her eyes. They followed her back across the plain and up the mountain paths. The journey felt shorter this time, as if the world itself was guiding them home. When they returned to the valley, the people gathered around to hear what she had seen. She told them everything, not with fear but with steady words about the ash, the symbols and the voice. She told them that the humans might return one day, but that they should not fight them with anger, because anger was what had created the distance between them long ago. The people listened, and for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel afraid. They began to talk about building watch stations, near the borders, not for war but for meeting. They wanted to be ready, not to fight but to speak if the humans ever came back. Lyra spent her days helping rebuild the new hall where the community met. She worked with her hands and taught the children what she had learned from the journey. She told them stories about Avon, about courage and kindness, and how remembering was the strongest thing anyone could do. She never spoke of the explosion itself, but always said that his light still lived in the sky, when the stars shone bright. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, turning the valley gold, she stood by the river again, holding the badge. The water reflected her face, and behind it she thought she saw a faint figure of Avon smiling. At her she didn't move. She just whispered softly, "I kept my promise." Then the wind blew gently and the figure faded into the light. She smiled and let the badge fall into the river, watching it drift away, carried by the current toward the open world beyond the hills. Years passed and the valley grew larger, stronger. The people learned to live with peace. They planted new crops and built wind towers to harness the air. They no longer feared the sky or the sound of machines. Sometimes they saw faint lights far away on the horizon, and they wondered if the humans had returned. But no one felt panic. They only watched quietly, waiting, and hoping that when the time came, it would be different. One morning, Lyra woke to see a group of strange shapes moving on the plain below. She climbed to the top of the hill and looked through a glass lens. She saw tall figures walking in lines, their bodies covered in smooth silver armor. They were not like before. They moved slower and carried no weapons. The others gathered behind her. Whispering with worry, she stayed calm and said, "They are coming, but not to destroy." They waited near the border as the figures approached. When they were close enough, Lyra stepped forward alone. The leader of the silver figures stopped and looked at her, his face hidden behind a mask that reflected the sky. She could see her own reflection in it. The figure spoke with a soft mechanical tone, saying, "We remember." A pause followed. Then he removed his mask, revealing a face that looked human but different, colder, yet somehow filled with something she could not describe. He said, "Once we erased our past, now we are searching for it again. We found your traces, your story, your light. We came not to conquer, but to learn." Lyra's eyes filled with tears. She said then, "You still have a heart, even if it is hidden." The man nodded slowly and said, "Maybe the heart was never gone, only asleep." She reached out her hand and he hesitated before taking it. His touch was cold but firm. The people behind her watched in silence as the old distance between the two kinds began to fade little by little. They talked for a long time, sharing what they remembered about the world before its division. The humans listened and asked questions, their voices quiet and careful, as if they were afraid of breaking something fragile. When night came, they lit fires together on both sides of the border. For the first time in centuries, the light of two worlds shone together under the same sky. Lyra looked at the flames and felt the warmth spread through her chest. She knew that Avon's sacrifice and the journey they made had not been in vain. The voice of the old human heart had been right. Memory had survived not in machines or cities, but in people who dared to remember. She looked up at the stars, whispering softly, "Thank you," as the night deepened. She watched the silver figures standing near the fire, their faces glowing in the light. Some of them looked almost human, now smiling awkwardly as they tried to speak with the children who laughed without fear. It was a simple scene, but it felt like the beginning of something new. The mountains were quiet. The sky was calm, and the river carried its song through the valley, carrying stories of the past into the endless horizon. And for the first time in her life, Lyra felt the world was whole again. Even if it was only for a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the sound of laughter and wind blend together, knowing that as long as someone remembered, the light would never fade.